Okay. My research paper was done on the Watergate grand jury investigation. Now, what the Watergate grand jury investigation was, um, let's take it back to 1972. 1972, president in office is Richard Nixon of the Republican Party. Richard Nixon had just won his last election by a landslide. He won on a law and order platform, conservative, and he had a very strong relationship with the Soviet Union. So, of course, the United States, he was a beloved figure in the United States, a very powerful leader. However, 5 burglars were arrested in June of 1972, 4 months before his next election, give or take 4.5. Now, during this investigation, the Washington Post falsely accused Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff of Nixon's party, for espionage and sabotage. Now, this false accusation resulted in a vigorous counterattack by the White House against the Washington Post. Now, as you can imagine, the executive director of the Washington Post, Benjamin Bradley, had his back against the wall. The 2 reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, had their backs against the wall, and they were looking for stories. Now, initially, how Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein are tied to the Watergate scandal. It was one of the 2 who had heard through a neighbor that someone might know someone who is in the grand jury for this case. Now, of course, they were looking for any story, but especially a story that would cover their rear ends in the Watergate scandal. Now, that source would fall through, but the story was still intriguing to the Post and the reporters. Now, the reporters organized a procedure for interviews that they would go through. And these procedures, they would tell the subject, the grand jury person, that they knew them through a mutual friend, and that they had heard that they somehow were in the grand jury. Now, before the interviews, the 2 reporters looked in and found out that the burden of secrecy was on the jurors. Nothing in the law forbade questioning them. And there's the green light. They were able to pursue this story, and they would. Now, the uncovering of these conducted interviews was more than they could have ever imagined. It would ultimately uncover and push Richard Nixon right out of office. It would save American democracy. Now, investigative news is so important to today's journalism. And this is a great example of investigative news and the power that it can have. Now, maybe not taking the best approach, or maybe not the best approach, because the approach was rushed. Of course, the approach was the interests, I do believe, the values, the best ethical principle that applies here is Rawls' veil of ignorance. The loyalties and the values were to the journalism practice, the public's need to know, and to democracy. And it would save American democracy, as the devastation of keeping someone like Richard Nixon, who was willing to twist the rules, willing to violate the law. This is not to downsize whatsoever that 5 burglars and much of the Republican Party were involved in this scandal. Now, the reward of looking into this, this was no typical crime story. This was no typical investigation. And Woodward and Bernstein quickly found that out. This is not something that a typical reporter is brave or courageous enough to dive into. I know myself, definitely not. Now, just as an example, earlier this school year, a teammate of mine, Ray Buford Jr., he had came to New Mexico State University after coming from small community college in Kansas. I can't think of the name of it, but he had spent a year at Kansas for a crime that he had committed as a freshman at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota. At the University of Minnesota, he was arrested and accused, not sure if ever charged, of raping a college student. Now, he went to community college. He had long story short, this was a story that I did not want to dive into, and as just talks to the tone of bravery of Woodward and Bernstein. Now, of course, this was for their job, and with their editor, of course, adding pressure, this was something that they had to do. But the published results, the resignation of President Nixon, as they were getting deeper into this investigation, I'm sure they realized how deep they were. They were in quicksand, or they were headed to the greatest uncovering this nation has ever had. And you know now in 2018 what this did. And although the ethics of crossing a line of legality may have been seen, it was definitely seen by Woodward, Bernstein, and the Washington Post of something they weren't very comfortable with. But what you want to see, what I said, the values, the loyalties, and ultimately what Woodward, the Post, were trying to get from this story were in the best intentions, what you want to hear from a journalist that they were serving the public's need to know, they were serving democracy, and they were serving the journalism practice. And that's the bottom line. Though they were crossing a line and doing something that had never been done before, the results were beneficial, and there was nothing you could really argue about that. Now, this was their claim to fame. It was huge. It was monumental that they had made such an impact, and ultimately saved our nation from a ton of headache. And God knows what could have happened to the future of our nation if it weren't for the brave acts of Woodward, Bernstein, and the Washington Post to go in, do this story, despite all of the roadblocks they had. When they did go to talk to the grand jury, they had to memorize everything. They had to memorize the names of the grand jurors when they initially pitched this story idea. Go back to just keep those names, keep going, and uncover these truths. It's why I love the journalism practice so much. It's what I want to do the rest of my life, because there needs to be a voice. There needs to be a voice for the people. And in this case, there had to be someone. and that they are heroes in American history because of this. And that is what I got. I have attached in the PowerPoint. I'm going to put my sources. I just wanted to thank you very much for another class that really improved me as a journalist, and I'm going to take a lot from it. So thank you very much, and best of luck to you in your retirement. God bless.